My name is Joaquin Herrera, and I'm a bodyguard who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. 3 days ago, I was protecting the CEO in downtown Los Angeles when the dead started walking. Now I'm trapped on the 47th floor. My client is dead, and the infected are scratching at my door. I trusted the wrong person, and it cost me everything. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Tuesday, October 15th, 2024 started like any other day in my 12-year career as a VIP protection specialist. I had been working for Sovereign Security Solutions for 4 years, handling the kind of clients who needed more than just a guy in a suit following them around. My name is Joaquin Herrera, and I specialized in what we called executive protection for Fortune 500 CEOs, tech billionaires, and the occasional celebrity who had made too many enemies. That morning, I was assigned to protect Amanda Walsh, the CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals. She was a brilliant woman in her early 50s who had built her company from the ground up, but recent corporate espionage investigations had made her a target. Someone was leaking sensitive research data, and the board suspected it might be connected to organized crime. That was why they hired me. I had arrived at the Meridian Tower in downtown Los Angeles at 6:30 in the morning, 3 hours before Amanda's board meeting was scheduled to begin. The building was a gleaming 50-story monument to corporate success, with Meridian Pharmaceuticals occupying the top 15 floors. My partner Rico Martinez was already there, checking the perimeter security systems and coordinating with the building's head of security, a guy named Carlos Martinez who had been working the building for 8 years. When I first met Carlos that morning, something felt off about him. He seemed distracted, kept adjusting his left sleeve, and when I asked him about the building's emergency protocols, he gave me answers that sounded rehearsed rather than natural. I made a mental note to keep an eye on him, but at the time, I figured he was just nervous about having federal-level security in his building. My military background had taught me to trust my instincts, and 8 years in the Army Special Forces had given me a pretty good radar for when people were hiding something. I had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to private security. And one thing I learned over there was that the person who seems the most helpful is often the one you need to watch most carefully. Carlos kept touching his arm throughout our morning briefing, claiming he had bumped it on a doorframe the night before. He was wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the October heat, and I noticed small beads of sweat on his forehead even though the building's air conditioning was running full blast. When I suggested he might want to have someone look at his injury, he quickly changed the subject and insisted he was fine. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on the 47th floor in the executive conference room. Amanda had requested maximum security because 3 of the board members had received threatening messages the previous week. The threats were vague but mentioned specific details about their personal lives that suggested serious surveillance. My job was to ensure nothing disrupted their quarterly review and strategic planning session. I had positioned myself near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of downtown Los Angeles. From that vantage point, I could monitor both the conference room and the street below. The UCL, a medical center, was directly across the street, and I could see the normal morning activity of ambulances, staff members, and visitors coming and going. Rico was stationed in the hallway outside the conference room, monitoring the elevator bank and stairwell access. We maintained constant radio contact using encrypted channels that couldn't be intercepted by standard equipment. Carlos had given U.S. access to the building's security system, which included cameras on every floor and emergency lockdown capabilities that could seal individual sections if necessary. At 8:45, Amanda arrived with her executive assistant and 3 other board members. She was a composed woman who carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from making life or death decisions about pharmaceutical research. She had founded Meridian Pharmaceuticals 23 years earlier with a focus on developing treatments for rare diseases, and her work had saved thousands of lives. Amanda greeted me professionally but warmly, asking about my family and thanking me for taking the assignment on short notice. I told her about my sister Elena, who worked as an environmental lawyer in San Francisco. Elena had always been the academic in our family, while I chose a more direct path of protecting people. Amanda seemed genuinely interested in our conversation, which was unusual for clients at her level. The meeting began promptly at 9 o'clock with Amanda presenting quarterly earnings reports to the board. I maintained my position near the windows, scanning the street below and monitoring our radio frequencies. Everything appeared normal for the first 20 minutes. The board members were engaged in typical corporate discussions about market shares, research budgets, and regulatory compliance. At 9:23, Rico's voice crackled through my earpiece with a tone I had never heard from him before. He was reporting some kind of disturbance at the medical center across the street. His voice was strained, almost panicked, which was completely out of character for someone with his training and experience. Rico had been my partner for 3 years, and I had never known him to get rattled by anything. I moved closer to the windows and used my binoculars to get a better view of the medical center. At first, I could only see people running from the building, which made me think there might be a fire or some kind of chemical leak. Hospital evacuations were not uncommon in a city like Los Angeles, and my initial instinct was to assess whether the situation posed any threat to our location. Following my standard protocol, I moved Amanda away from the windows and positioned her in the interior section of the conference room. I explained that there appeared to be some kind of emergency at the medical center and that I was taking precautionary measures. She nodded and continued with her presentation, trusting my judgment completely. Carlos appeared at the conference room door, claiming he had seen the same disturbance and offering to help coordinate with emergency services. His presence made me uncomfortable because he had not been summoned, and his timing seemed too convenient. I told him to return to his security station and monitor the building's systems, but he lingered for several seconds before complying. Through my binoculars, I watched as more people fled the medical center. The evacuation seemed chaotic rather than organized, which suggested this was not a planned drill or standard emergency procedure. I could see medical staff running without their equipment, patients in hospital gowns stumbling into the street, and security guards who appeared to be fleeing rather than maintaining order. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the people who had been evacuated from the medical center, a patient still wearing a hospital gown, suddenly tackled a fleeing nurse to the ground. From my position 47 floors above, I could see the patient attacking the nurse with what appeared to be his teeth. The nurse was screaming and trying to fight back, but the patient seemed to have inhuman strength. I immediately contacted Rico and told him to switch to our emergency frequency. I needed to know if he was seeing the same thing I was witnessing. His response confirmed my worst fears. He was watching from the ground level and could see multiple patients attacking medical staff and other civilians. He described scenes of violence that sounded more like something from a horror movie than a medical emergency. The board members in the conference room continued their meeting, completely unaware of what was happening outside. I made the decision to interrupt their discussion and inform Amanda that we had a serious situation developing. I explained that there appeared to be some kind of violent incident at the medical center and that I was implementing enhanced security measures. Amanda looked concerned but remained calm. She asked if we should evacuate the building, and I told her that my assessment was ongoing, but that our current location was secure. The truth was that I had no idea what we were dealing with, but my training told me that staying in a controlled environment was better than entering an unknown situation on the street level. At 9:45, the first emergency broadcasts began appearing on local news stations. The reports were calling it an outbreak of extreme violence at multiple medical facilities throughout Los Angeles. The anchors seemed confused and were struggling to explain what they were seeing. Terms like unexplained aggression and isolated incidents were being used, but I could tell from their expressions that they were as bewildered as everyone else. I called my sister Elena in San Francisco to warn her about what was happening and to tell her to avoid any medical facilities. Her phone rang several times before going to voicemail. I left a message telling her to stay inside and to call me back immediately. Elena had always been the one person I could count on, and not being able to reach her made me more anxious than I wanted to admit. Carlos reappeared at the conference room, this time claiming that building management wanted to implement lockdown procedures. He said that the situation outside was getting worse and that they were concerned about public safety. I found his sudden helpfulness suspicious, especially since he had been absent from his security station for nearly 10 minutes. The board members were becoming increasingly agitated as more emergency broadcasts interrupted their meeting. One of them, a man named Robert Chun, demanded to know what was happening and why they were being kept in the dark. I explained that we were dealing with an evolving situation and that my priority was their safety above all else. At 10 o'clock, the emergency broadcasts became more urgent. Reports were coming in from multiple locations throughout the city, and the authorities were advising people to avoid downtown areas. The term reanimated was being used for the first time, though the news anchors seemed reluctant to explain what that meant. I made the decision to activate the building's emergency lockdown system. This would seal the executive floors and prevent unauthorized access through the elevators and stairwells. Carlos offered to help me implement the lockdown, but I declined his assistance and handled the procedure myself. I wanted to maintain complete control over who had access to our location. The lockdown system was designed to turn the executive floors into a secure refuge in case of terrorist attacks or other threats. It included independent power systems, communication equipment, and enough food and water to sustain a small group. For several days, I had familiarized myself with these systems during my initial security assessment, never imagining I would actually need to use them. Amanda and the board members were becoming increasingly concerned about the situation. They were receiving calls from family members and colleagues throughout the city, all reporting similar incidents of violence and chaos. Amanda asked me directly if I thought they were safe, and I told her that our current location was as secure as anywhere in the city. At 10:15, Rico reported that the medical center across the street had been completely evacuated and that military vehicles were beginning to arrive in the area. He could see soldiers in full combat gear establishing a perimeter around the building. The presence of military forces confirmed that this was not a localized incident, but something much more serious. I tried calling Elena again, but her phone was now going straight to voicemail without ringing. The same thing was happening when I tried to contact other family members and colleagues. The communication networks were becoming overloaded as people throughout the city tried to reach their loved ones. Carlos volunteered to monitor the building's external cameras and report any unusual activity. I agreed to this arrangement, but told him to maintain constant radio contact and to report anything suspicious immediately. I was beginning to suspect that the situation outside was more dangerous than anyone was admitting, and I wanted to ensure we had early warning of any threats. The board members were watching the news coverage with growing alarm. Reports were coming in from hospitals throughout Los Angeles, and similar incidents were being reported in other major cities. The authorities were advising people to remain indoors and to avoid contact with anyone who appeared ill or injured. At 10:30, I witnessed something through the conference room windows that changed everything. A group of people who appeared to be patients from the medical center were moving through the street below in what looked like a coordinated manner. They were not walking normally, but seemed to be hunting or searching for something specific. When they encountered other people, they attacked with the same savage intensity I had seen earlier. I realized that we were not dealing with a medical emergency or even a terrorist attack. This was something entirely different, something that my military training had not prepared me for. The people attacking others were not acting like criminals or enemy combatants. They were behaving like predators driven by an insatiable hunger. Rico's voice came through my earpiece with an update that confirmed my worst fears. He reported that some of the attacking individuals appeared to be people who had been declared dead at the medical center. He had spoken with a fleeing doctor, who claimed that patients who had died from various causes were somehow returning to life with an aggressive compulsion to attack the living. The news broadcasts were becoming more chaotic as reporters struggled to explain what they were witnessing. The term zombie was being used, though most of the media outlets seemed reluctant to accept such an explanation. Government officials were calling for calm while admitting they had no clear understanding of what was causing the violence. I made the decision to gather everyone in the conference room for a security briefing. I explained that we were dealing with an unprecedented situation that required us to treat the building as a fortress under siege. I told them that my assessment was that the streets were no longer safe and that our best option was to remain in our secured location until authorities could regain control. Amanda asked me directly if I believed the reports about people returning from the dead. I told her that regardless of the explanation, the reality was that we were facing extremely dangerous individuals who were attacking innocent people. My job was to protect her and the other board members, not to understand the science behind what was happening. At 10:45, the first infected individuals appeared on the streets directly below our building. I watched through binoculars as they moved with a disturbing sense of purpose, investigating vehicles and buildings as if they were searching for something specific. When they encountered other people, the attacks were swift and brutal. Carlos reported that he was monitoring the building's ground floor cameras and that several suspicious individuals were approaching the main entrance. I told him to ensure that all public access points were secured and that no one should be allowed to enter the building without my direct authorization. The board members were becoming increasingly panicked as they watched the situation deteriorate outside. One of them, a woman named Patricia Williams, demanded that we evacuate immediately and try to reach her family in Pasadena. I explained that leaving the building would expose us to far greater danger than remaining in our secured location. At 11 o'clock, power fluctuations began affecting parts of the city. We could see traffic lights failing and emergency vehicle sirens becoming more frequent. The normal rhythm of urban life was breaking down as people fled their homes and businesses. From our vantage point, Los Angeles looked like a city under siege. I attempted to contact my sister Elena one more time, but the call would not go through at all. The cellular networks were becoming completely overloaded, and landline connections were also failing. I realized that we were becoming isolated from the outside world just as the situation was reaching its most critical point. Carlos volunteered to help me establish alternative communication methods using the building's emergency systems. I accepted his offer, but insisted that we work together rather than allowing him to handle any procedures independently. Something about his eagerness to help continued to make me uncomfortable, though I could not identify any specific reason for my suspicions. The news broadcasts were becoming increasingly desperate as reporters struggled to maintain their composure while describing unprecedented scenes of violence. Military forces were being deployed throughout the city, and martial law was being declared in several districts. The authorities were advising people to barricade themselves in secure locations and to avoid any contact with infected individuals. At 11:30, I made the decision to implement full combat readiness protocols. I retrieved my backup weapons from the secure storage area and distributed emergency supplies to everyone in the conference room. I explained that we needed to prepare for the possibility of a prolonged siege, and that everyone would need to follow my instructions without question. Amanda asked me about my assessment of our long-term prospects. I told her that our immediate situation was secure, but that I could not predict how long the crisis would last or when normal services would be restored. My priority was ensuring their survival for as long as necessary, regardless of what was happening in the outside world. The board members were struggling to process the reality of their situation. These were people who were accustomed to controlling their environment and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Now they were completely dependent on my judgment and expertise for their survival. At 11:45, Rico reported that infected individuals had entered the building's ground floor. Carlos confirmed this report through the security cameras, explaining that several people had somehow gained access through the parking garage. I immediately activated additional security measures to prevent them from reaching the upper floors. The elevator systems were automatically shut down as part of the lockdown protocol, and the stairwells were sealed at multiple points. The infected individuals would need to break through reinforced doors and navigate security barriers to reach our location. I calculated that we had several hours before they could pose any direct threat to the executive floors. Carlos offered to coordinate with building maintenance to ensure that all potential access points were secured. I agreed to this plan but insisted that he maintain constant communication and report any changes immediately. I was beginning to realize that his knowledge of the building's systems would be crucial to our survival. At noon, the sounds of gunfire began echoing through the downtown area. Military forces were engaging infected individuals in the streets below, and the intensity of the conflict was escalating rapidly. I could see muzzle flashes from weapons and smoke rising from multiple locations throughout the city. The board members were watching the military response with a mixture of hope and terror. They wanted to believe that the authorities could regain control of the situation, but the scale of the violence suggested that this was beyond anything law enforcement or military forces had ever encountered. I tried to maintain an atmosphere of calm professionalism while internally preparing for the worst-case scenario. My military training had taught me to hope for the best while planning for complete disaster. I began making contingency plans for various threats, including the possibility that the infected might somehow reach our floor. At 12:15, the first reports of infected individuals working together began appearing on the news broadcasts. Rather than acting as isolated attackers, they were apparently coordinating their efforts to overcome barriers and pursue specific targets. This intelligence changed my assessment of the threat level significantly. Carlos reported that the infected individuals in the building were attempting to access the stairwell systematically. They were not randomly wandering, but seemed to be following some kind of strategy to reach the upper floors. I realized that we were not dealing with mindless attackers, but with something far more dangerous. The news broadcasts were becoming increasingly fragmented as communication systems throughout the city failed. Reports were coming in from other major cities, suggesting that the outbreak was not limited to Los Angeles. New York, Chicago, and Houston were all reporting similar incidents of violence and social breakdown. At 12:30, I made the decision to establish watch rotations to ensure continuous monitoring of our situation. I assigned specific responsibilities to each person in the conference room, including Amanda and the board members. Everyone would need to contribute to our security if we were going to survive. Carlos volunteered to take the first watch shift, claiming that his knowledge of the building's systems made him the most qualified person for the job. I accepted his offer but made it clear that I would be monitoring his activities and that he should report any observations immediately. The afternoon wore on with reports of the situation deteriorating throughout the city. Emergency services were becoming overwhelmed, and normal government functions were beginning to break down. We were witnessing the collapse of civilization in real time, and our small group was becoming an island of relative safety in an ocean of chaos. At 1 o'clock, I realized that we were facing a fundamentally different kind of threat than anything I had been trained to handle. The infected individuals were not terrorists or criminals who could be negotiated with or deterred. They were driven by something primal and relentless that made them extremely dangerous in ways that conventional security measures could not address. The news broadcasts were reporting that the infection was spreading through bite transmission and that anyone who was bitten would become infected within hours. This information changed everything about how we needed to approach our security. A single breach of our defenses could compromise our entire group. I began implementing strict protocols for monitoring everyone's health and behavior. Any sign of illness or injury would need to be reported immediately, and anyone who had been exposed to infected individuals would need to be isolated until we could determine their status. Carlos continued to report on the building's security systems throughout the afternoon. He seemed to have detailed knowledge of every access point and potential vulnerability. His information was valuable, but I remained concerned about his earlier behavior and his apparent eagerness to be involved in every aspect of our security. At 2 o'clock, the power grid began experiencing systematic failures throughout the city. We could see entire neighborhoods going dark as the electrical infrastructure succumbed to the chaos. Our building's emergency power systems activated automatically, but I realized that we could not depend on external utilities for much longer. The board members were struggling to cope with the psychological impact of watching their world collapse. These were people who had built their careers on planning and controlling complex situations, but they were now facing something that defied all conventional understanding. Amanda asked me about my own family and whether I was worried about their safety. I told her about Elena and explained that not being able to contact her was one of the most difficult aspects of the situation. She seemed to understand that even those of us trained for crisis situations were struggling with the human cost of what was happening. At 2:30, reports began coming in about infected individuals who seemed to retain some memories from their previous lives. They were returning to familiar locations and recognizing faces, which made encounters with infected loved ones particularly traumatic for survivors. This information made me think about Carlos and his detailed knowledge of the building. If someone who worked in the building became infected, they would know exactly how to access areas that should be secure. I made a mental note to be especially vigilant about anyone who showed signs of illness or unusual behavior. The news broadcasts were reporting that evacuation centers were becoming death traps as infected individuals infiltrated groups of survivors. The authorities were advising people to avoid large gatherings and to trust no one who had been exposed to infected individuals. At 3 o'clock, I implemented additional security measures to ensure that our group remained isolated from any potential threats. I established procedures for monitoring everyone's health and behavior, and I made it clear that anyone who showed signs of illness would need to be quarantined immediately. Carlos volunteered to help me establish these protocols, explaining that his security experience made him qualified to assist with health monitoring. I accepted his offer, but insisted that all health assessments would ultimately be my responsibility. The afternoon continued with reports of the situation becoming increasingly desperate throughout the city. Military forces were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected individuals, and normal command structures were breaking down. We were witnessing the complete collapse of organized society. At 4 o'clock, I realized that our situation was likely to continue for days or possibly weeks. The scale of the outbreak suggested that this was not something that could be resolved quickly, and we needed to prepare for a prolonged siege. I began making plans for rationing our supplies and establishing long-term security procedures. The board members were asking increasingly difficult questions about our prospects for survival and rescue. I explained that my priority was ensuring their immediate safety, and that I could not make predictions about when or how the crisis would be resolved. Carlos continued to provide valuable information about the building's systems and security features. His knowledge was helping us maintain our defenses, but I remained concerned about his earlier behavior and his apparent anxiety about something he would not discuss. At 5 o'clock, the sun began setting over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across a city that had been transformed into a battlefield. The normal sounds of urban life had been replaced by sirens, gunfire, and the distant sounds of conflict. We were facing our first night in a world that had fundamentally changed. I made the decision to establish formal watch rotations for the night hours. Everyone in our group would need to take turns monitoring our security, and I wanted to ensure that we maintained constant vigilance throughout the darkness. Carlos volunteered to take the first night watch, claiming that his familiarity with the building systems made him the best choice for the position. I had concerns about his earlier behavior, but his knowledge of the building was genuinely valuable, and I needed to trust someone to help maintain our security. As the evening progressed, I began to realize that the infected individuals in the building were becoming more systematic in their efforts to reach the upper floors. They were not giving up or becoming distracted, but seemed to be persistently working toward a specific goal. The news broadcasts were becoming increasingly fragmented as communication systems throughout the city continued to fail. The last reliable reports suggested that the outbreak was spreading to other countries, and that this was becoming a global crisis rather than a localized incident. At 6 o'clock, I made final preparations for our first night in the new world. I distributed emergency supplies, established communication protocols, and made sure that everyone understood their responsibilities for maintaining our security. What I thought was the beginning of a riot was actually the end of the world as we knew it, and I was about to learn that my biggest threat was not coming from the streets below. The emergency power kicked in as darkness fell over Los Angeles, casting our conference room in the harsh glow of backup lighting. I had been in combat situations before, but watching a major American city collapse from 47 floors above was something my military training had never prepared me for. The infected had been in our building for hours now, and I could hear them moving through the lower floors with a persistence that was deeply unsettling. I had established our resource inventory immediately. After the lockdown, the executive floor had been designed as a secure refuge, with enough bottled water for 8 people for approximately 5 days, emergency food supplies that could stretch to a week if carefully rationed, and basic medical supplies. My tactical gear included my primary weapon, a Glock 19 with 3 spare magazines, my backup knife, tactical radio equipment, and night vision capabilities. Amanda was handling the stress better than most of the board members, but I could see the strain in her eyes. She kept asking about her daughter Sarah, who was attending graduate school at UC Berkeley. Every attempt to contact Sarah had failed, and the uncertainty was eating at Amanda in ways that reminded me of my own concern for Elena. I had tried calling my sister in San Francisco 17 times since the outbreak began, and every call had gone straight to voicemail. The board members were struggling to process what they were witnessing. Robert Chun, the chief financial officer, kept insisting that the military would restore order within hours. Patricia Williams, the head of research and development, was convinced that this was some kind of biological weapon deployed by foreign adversaries. Dr. James Morrison, the medical director, was the most disturbing to watch because he understood the implications of what we were seeing better than anyone else. Dr. Morrison had been studying the news reports with professional interest, and his conclusions were terrifying. He explained that the infection appeared to be transmitted through direct blood contact, most commonly through bites, and that the incubation period was approximately 6 hours. What made this particularly dangerous was that infected individuals retained enough cognitive function to use tools, coordinate attacks, and remember locations that had been important to them in life. Carlos had been monitoring the building's security systems throughout the evening, providing regular reports on the infected individuals who were systematically working their way through the lower floors. They were not randomly wandering, but seemed to be following some kind of strategy to reach the upper levels. His knowledge of the building's layout was proving invaluable, but I noticed that he was becoming increasingly agitated as the night progressed. Around 7 o'clock, Carlos reported that the infected had breached the stairwell barriers on the 15th floor. They were moving upward at a rate of approximately 2 floors per hour, which gave us time to prepare, but also meant that they would eventually reach our location. The security doors were solid steel with electronic locks, but Dr. Morrison pointed out that infected individuals had been observed using basic tools to overcome obstacles. The news broadcasts were becoming increasingly desperate as reporters struggled to maintain their composure while describing the collapse of major cities. Los Angeles was not the only location affected by the outbreak. Similar incidents were being reported from New York, Chicago, Houston, and Atlanta. The federal government had declared martial law in 12 states, but military forces were being overwhelmed by the sheer number of infected individuals. I had been trying to maintain radio contact with Rico, but his last transmission had been at 6:15 when he reported that infected individuals were entering the building through multiple access points. Since then, there had been only static on our emergency frequency. I had to assume that he was either dead or had been forced to abandon his position to survive. Amanda asked me directly about our chances of survival, and I gave her the most honest assessment I could manage. Our immediate situation was secure, but we were facing a siege that could last for weeks or months. The infected individuals showed no signs of giving up or becoming distracted, and they appeared to be driven by a relentless hunger that made them extremely dangerous opponents. Patricia Williams was becoming increasingly panicked as she watched the military response failing on the news broadcasts. She demanded that we attempt to evacuate the building and try to reach the evacuation centers that were being established outside the city. I explained that the evacuation centers were being overrun by infected individuals, and that leaving our secure location would expose us to far greater danger. Dr. Morrison supported my assessment, explaining that the infection was spreading too rapidly for any evacuation to be successful. He estimated that within 72 hours, the infected would outnumber the living in most urban areas. The only realistic strategy was to find secure locations and wait for the situation to stabilize, though he admitted that he had no idea how long that might take. Carlos volunteered to help me establish better defensive positions around the conference room. He explained that the building's executive floor had been designed with security features that could be activated to create multiple barriers between us and any potential threats. I accepted his offer, but insisted that we work together rather than allowing him to handle any procedures independently. Around 8 o'clock, the power grid failures began affecting our area of the city. We could see entire neighborhoods going dark as the electrical infrastructure succumbed to the chaos. Our building's emergency power systems were functioning, but I realized that we could not depend on external utilities for much longer. The backup generators had enough fuel for approximately 48 hours of continuous operation. The infected individuals in the building were becoming more systematic in their approach to reaching the upper floors. Carlos reported that they were using furniture and debris to overcome barriers, and they seemed to be learning from their failures. This intelligence suggested that we were not dealing with mindless attackers, but with something that retained enough cognitive function to adapt to obstacles. Amanda was trying to maintain her composure, but I could see that she was struggling with the psychological impact of watching her world collapse. She had built Meridian Pharmaceuticals into one of the most successful companies in the industry, and now she was trapped in her own building while civilization crumbled around her. I tried to reassure her that we would survive this crisis, but the truth was that I had no idea what we were really facing. The news broadcasts were reporting that the infection was spreading through bite transmission with a 100% infection rate. Anyone who was bitten would become infected within 6 hours, and there was no known treatment or cure. This information changed everything about how we needed to approach our security. A single breach of our defenses could compromise our entire group. Robert Chun was becoming increasingly agitated as he watched the stock market collapse on his phone. He kept insisting that this was a temporary crisis that would be resolved within days. But the economic indicators suggested that normal business operations would not resume for months or possibly years. The psychological impact of watching his professional world disappear was almost as traumatic as the physical danger we were facing. Around 9 o'clock, I implemented strict protocols for monitoring everyone's health and behavior. Any sign of illness or injury would need to be reported immediately, and anyone who had been exposed to infected individuals would need to be isolated until we could determine their status. I explained that these measures were necessary to prevent the infection from spreading within our group. Carlos seemed uncomfortable with the health monitoring protocols, claiming that they were unnecessary because none of us had been exposed to infected individuals. I explained that we could not afford to take any chances and that everyone would need to submit to regular health assessments. He agreed to comply with the procedures, but I noticed that he was avoiding direct eye contact. During our conversation, Dr. Morrison was providing medical guidance about the signs and symptoms of infection. He explained that the early stages included fever, sweating, irritability, and unusual aggression. The transformation process was apparently extremely painful, and infected individuals often tried to hide their condition until it was too late. To prevent transmission, the board members were asking increasingly difficult questions about our long-term prospects. They wanted to know when rescue operations would begin and how we would signal for help when the crisis was over. I explained that my priority was ensuring their immediate survival and that I could not make predictions about when or how the situation would be resolved. Around 10 o'clock, the infected individuals reached the 25th floor of our building. Carlos reported that they were moving with increased urgency, as if they were aware that their targets were somewhere above them. The security cameras showed groups of infected individuals working together to overcome barriers, using a level of coordination that was deeply disturbing. Patricia Williams was becoming increasingly hysterical as she watched the military forces being overwhelmed. On the news broadcasts, she was convinced that the government was lying about the extent of the crisis and that the situation was far worse than anyone was admitting. Dr. Morrison tried to calm her down, but his own assessment of the situation was equally pessimistic. The news broadcasts were reporting that infected individuals seemed to retain memories from their previous lives. They were returning to familiar locations and recognizing faces, which made encounters with infected loved ones particularly traumatic for survivors. This information made me think about Carlos and his detailed knowledge of the building. If someone who worked in the building became infected, they would know exactly how to access areas that should be secure. I decided to establish formal watch rotations for the night hours. Everyone in our group would need to take turns monitoring our security, and I wanted to ensure that we maintained constant vigilance throughout the darkness. Carlos volunteered to take the first night watch, claiming that his familiarity with the building's systems made him the best choice for the position. Amanda asked me about my own family and whether I was worried about their safety. I told her about Elena and explained that not being able to contact her was one of the most difficult aspects of the situation. She seemed to understand that even those of us trained for crisis situations were struggling with the human cost of what was happening. Around 11 o'clock, reports began coming in about evacuation centers being overrun by infected individuals. The authorities were advising people to avoid large gatherings and to trust no one who had been exposed to infected individuals. This information confirmed my decision to keep our group isolated in the building rather than attempting to reach any evacuation points. The infected individuals in the building were now on the 30th floor and continuing to move upward. Carlos reported that they were becoming more aggressive in their efforts to overcome barriers, and several security doors had been breached through what appeared to be coordinated attacks. I realized that we had perhaps 6 hours before they could reach our location. Dr. Morrison was explaining the medical implications of the infection to the group. He believed that the virus was affecting the brainstem and nervous system, preserving basic motor functions while eliminating higher cognitive abilities. The infected retained enough intelligence to use tools and coordinate attacks, but they had lost all sense of empathy, morality, and self-preservation. Robert Chun was trying to contact his wife in Beverly Hills, but the cellular networks were completely overloaded. He was becoming increasingly desperate as he realized that he might never see his family again. The psychological impact of being separated from loved ones during a crisis was affecting everyone in the group, including me. Around midnight, I made the decision to implement additional security measures to ensure that our group remained isolated from any potential threats. I established procedures for monitoring everyone's health and behavior, and I made it clear that anyone who showed signs of illness would need to be quarantined immediately. Carlos volunteered to help me establish these protocols, explaining that his security experience made him qualified to assist with health monitoring. I accepted his offer, but insisted that all health assessments would ultimately be my responsibility. Something about his eagerness to be involved in every aspect of our security continued to make me uncomfortable. The news broadcasts were becoming increasingly fragmented as communication systems throughout the city continued to fail. The last reliable report suggested that the outbreak was spreading to other countries and that this was becoming a global crisis rather than a localized incident. Major cities in Europe and Asia were reporting similar outbreaks, and international air travel had been suspended. Patricia Williams was demanding that we attempt to contact the pharmaceutical industry's emergency response network. She believed that other companies might have developed treatments or vaccines that could help us survive the crisis. Dr. Morrison explained that the speed of the infection's spread made it unlikely that any treatments had been developed, but he agreed to try contacting his professional colleagues. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the infected individuals reached the 35th floor of our building. They were moving faster than my initial calculations had predicted, which meant that they would reach our location within 3 hours. Carlos reported that they were using increasingly sophisticated methods to overcome barriers, and several groups appeared to be working together to breach security doors. I began making final preparations for a potential confrontation with infected individuals. I distributed emergency supplies, established communication protocols, and made sure that everyone understood their responsibilities for maintaining our security. The board members were struggling to accept that they might need to defend themselves against attackers who had once been human beings. Amanda was trying to maintain her composure, but I could see that she was terrified about what the next few hours might bring. She asked me if I thought we would survive until morning, and I told her that my job was to ensure their safety regardless of what we faced. I had promised to protect her, and I intended to keep that promise even if it cost me my life. Carlos was becoming increasingly agitated as he monitored the building's security systems. He kept touching his left arm and seemed to be sweating despite the air conditioning. When I asked him about his earlier injury, he claimed that it was just a minor bruise that was bothering him. I made a mental note to keep a closer eye on his behavior. Around 2 o'clock, the infected individuals reached the 40th floor. They were now only 7 floors below our location, and I could hear them moving through the building's structure. The sounds were unlike anything I had experienced before, a combination of human voices and something more primal that suggested they were operating on pure instinct. Dr. Morrison was explaining that the infection appeared to be affecting the infected individuals' pain receptors, making them extremely difficult to stop through conventional means. They would continue attacking until they were physically incapacitated, which meant that defensive measures needed to be lethal rather than merely deterrent. The news broadcasts were reporting that military forces were being withdrawn from urban areas and that survivors were being advised to fend for themselves. The federal government was establishing secure zones in rural areas, but there was no indication of when or how rescue operations might begin. We were effectively on our own until the situation stabilized. Robert Chun was becoming increasingly desperate as he realized that his family was probably dead. The psychological impact of losing everything he had worked for was almost as traumatic as the physical danger we were facing. I tried to keep him focused on our immediate survival, but the emotional toll of the crisis was affecting everyone in the group. Around 3 o'clock, Carlos reported that the infected individuals were on the 44th floor and moving with increased urgency. He seemed to know their exact location and movements, which I found suspicious given that several of the security cameras had been destroyed. When I asked him how he was tracking their progress, he gave me an evasive answer that made me more concerned about his behavior. Patricia Williams was demanding that we attempt to escape through the building's emergency systems. She believed that there might be secure routes that would allow us to reach the roof or parking garage without encountering infected individuals. I explained that any attempt to leave our secure location would expose us to far greater danger than remaining in place. The infected individuals were now close enough that I could hear them attempting to breach the security doors on the 45th floor. The sounds were systematic and persistent, suggesting that they were not giving up or becoming distracted. I realized that we were facing a siege that could last for hours or days, depending on how long our defensive barriers held. Amanda asked me about my assessment of Carlos's behavior, and I admitted that I was concerned about his increasing agitation and evasive answers. She agreed that something seemed wrong with him, but we both acknowledged that his knowledge of the building's systems was crucial to our survival. I made the decision to monitor him more closely during the night watch rotations. Around 4 o'clock, the infected individuals breached the security door on the 45th floor. Carlos reported that they were moving with increased coordination and seemed to be following a specific strategy to reach the upper floors. I realized that we were facing opponents who retained enough intelligence to adapt to obstacles and coordinate their attacks. Dr. Morrison was explaining that the infection might be preserving certain types of memory while destroying others. The infected individuals could remember locations and faces from their previous lives, but they had lost all sense of empathy and morality. This made them extremely dangerous because they could use familiar knowledge to overcome security measures. The news broadcasts were reporting that the infection was spreading to rural areas and that the secure zones were being overrun by infected individuals. The federal government was losing control of the situation, and state authorities were implementing their own emergency measures. We were witnessing the complete breakdown of organized society. Around 5 o'clock, I made the decision to prepare for direct confrontation with infected individuals. I explained to the group that our defensive barriers would not hold indefinitely, and that we needed to be ready to defend ourselves. The board members were struggling to accept that they might need to fight for their lives against attackers who had once been human beings. Carlos volunteered to take the most dangerous defensive position, claiming that his security experience made him the best qualified person for the job. I accepted his offer but insisted that we work together rather than allowing him to handle any procedures independently. Something about his eagerness to be in the most dangerous position made me uncomfortable. The infected individuals were now on the 46th floor, just one floor below our location. I could hear them moving through the building's structure with increasing urgency, and Carlos reported that they were using tools and debris to overcome barriers. We were facing our final defensive position, and I realized that the next few hours would determine whether we survived the night. Amanda was trying to maintain her composure, but I could see that she was terrified about what the next few hours might bring. She asked me if I thought we would survive until morning, and I told her that my job was to ensure their safety regardless of what we faced. I had survived combat situations before, but this was different because we were facing opponents who had once been human beings. The sun was beginning to rise over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across a city that had been transformed into a battlefield. The normal sounds of urban life had been replaced by sirens, gunfire, and the distant sounds of conflict. We were facing our first dawn in a world that had fundamentally changed, and I was beginning to realize that my training might not be sufficient for what we were about to encounter. I thought the worst part would be watching the city die, but I was wrong. The real nightmare was about to begin right here in our supposed safe haven. The infected had reached the 47th floor by 6 in the morning, and I could hear them testing the reinforced security door that separated our executive suite from the main hallway. The sounds they made were methodical and persistent, like they were systematically probing for weaknesses in our defenses. Carlos was monitoring their movements through the remaining security cameras, providing updates that were becoming increasingly urgent. I had positioned everyone in the interior section of the conference room, away from the windows and doors. Amanda was staying close to me, following my instructions without question, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The board members were huddled together near the emergency supply cabinet, and Dr. Morrison was reviewing our medical supplies in case anyone was injured in a potential confrontation. Carlos reported that the infected individuals were using tools they had scavenged from the lower floors to attack the security door. They had found maintenance equipment and were working together to breach our defenses with a level of coordination that was deeply disturbing. His knowledge of their exact activities seemed unusually detailed, considering that most of the security cameras in that area had been destroyed hours earlier. The security door was designed to withstand significant force, but it was not meant to resist a prolonged assault by multiple attackers using tools. I estimated that we had perhaps 2 hours before they could breach our primary defensive barrier. Once they gained access to the executive suite, we would be fighting in close quarters, with limited options for retreat or escape. I began implementing our final defensive preparations, positioning furniture to create additional barriers and establishing fields of fire that would give us tactical advantages if we were forced to engage the infected individuals directly. My military training had taught me that defensive positions were only as strong as the people defending them, and I was concerned about how the board members would perform under extreme stress. Patricia Williams was becoming increasingly hysterical as she listened to the sounds of the infected attacking our security door. She kept insisting that we should attempt to escape through the building's ventilation systems or emergency exits. I explained that any attempt to leave our secure location would expose us to far greater danger than remaining in our defensive position. Dr. Morrison was studying the infection patterns we had observed throughout the night, and his conclusions were troubling. He believed that the infected individuals were retaining more cognitive function than initial reports had suggested. They were using tools, coordinating attacks, and adapting to obstacles in ways that indicated they possessed significant problem-solving abilities. Around 7 o'clock, Carlos volunteered to establish a forward observation post near the security door to provide better intelligence about the infected individuals' activities. I was reluctant to allow anyone to get that close to potential danger, but his argument that we needed accurate information about their capabilities was compelling. I agreed to his proposal but insisted that he maintain constant radio contact. Amanda asked me about my experience with similar situations, and I had to admit that nothing in my military or security background had prepared me for this type of threat. I had faced enemy combatants who could be reasoned with, deterred, or defeated through conventional tactics. The infected individuals were driven by something primal that made normal defensive strategies less effective. The infected had been working on our security door for over an hour, and I could see that they were making progress. The reinforced steel was beginning to show signs of stress, and the electronic lock mechanism was sparking from their repeated attacks. Carlos reported that they were using a systematic approach, focusing their efforts on the weakest points of the door's construction. Robert Chun was trying to contact emergency services on his cell phone, but the networks were completely down. He was becoming increasingly frustrated as he realized that we were completely isolated from any potential rescue operations. The psychological impact of being cut off from the outside world was affecting everyone in the group, including me. Around 8 o'clock, I made the decision to distribute weapons to everyone in the group. I had limited ammunition for my primary weapon, so I needed to ensure that everyone could contribute to our defense if necessary. Dr. Morrison was the most reluctant to accept a weapon, but he understood that our survival might depend on everyone being willing to fight. Carlos was providing increasingly detailed reports about the infected individuals' activities, describing their movements and tactics with an accuracy that seemed unusual given his observation position. When I asked him how he could see so much detail through the limited camera coverage, he gave me an evasive answer that made me more suspicious of his behavior. The infected individuals were now using coordinated attacks on multiple weak points of the security door simultaneously. They had somehow figured out that distributing their efforts would be more effective than focusing on a single area. This level of tactical thinking was far beyond what anyone had expected from infected individuals. Patricia Williams was demanding that we contact the pharmaceutical industry's emergency response network to request immediate evacuation. She believed that Meridian Pharmaceuticals had resources that could help us escape from our situation. Dr. Morrison explained that the company's emergency protocols were designed for conventional threats, not for a complete breakdown of civilization. Around 9 o'clock, the security door began showing serious structural damage from the infected individual's persistent attacks. I could see cracks forming around the hinges, and the electronic lock was failing intermittently. Carlos reported that they were using leverage techniques that suggested they understood basic engineering principles. I began making final preparations for close-quarters combat, ensuring that everyone understood their assigned positions and responsibilities. Amanda would stay near the emergency communication equipment to call for help if any rescue operations became available. The board members would provide support and backup, while Carlos and I would handle the primary defensive responsibilities. Dr. Morrison was explaining the medical implications of fighting infected individuals, emphasizing that any contact with their blood or saliva could result in transmission of the infection. He stressed that anyone who was injured during a confrontation would need immediate medical attention and possible quarantine to prevent the spread of infection within our group. The infected individuals were now making enough progress that I could see light coming through small gaps around the security door. They had been working for over 3 hours with single-minded determination, never stopping to rest or becoming distracted by other activities. This persistence was unlike anything I had encountered in human combatants. Around 10 o'clock, Carlos reported that the infected individuals were preparing for a final assault on the security door. He seemed to know exactly when they would breach our defenses, which struck me as unusual given that he was supposedly observing them through damaged security cameras. His detailed knowledge of their activities was becoming increasingly suspicious. Amanda asked me directly about our chances of survival if the infected individuals breached our defenses. I gave her the most honest assessment I could manage, explaining that our tactical position was strong, but that we were facing opponents who were extremely difficult to stop through conventional means. I promised her that I would do everything possible to protect her and the other board members. The security door was now showing critical structural damage, with large cracks forming around the frame and the electronic lock completely failing. I could hear the infected individuals coordinating their final assault, and their voices had a quality that was both human and something else entirely. Carlos reported that they would breach our defenses within the next 30 minutes. Robert Chun was asking about evacuation procedures and emergency escape routes, but I had to explain that we were committed to defending our current position. Any attempt to retreat would expose us to attack while we were moving, and we had no guarantee that other areas of the building would be more secure than our current location. Around 11 o'clock, I noticed that Carlos was becoming increasingly agitated and seemed to be avoiding direct contact with the other members of our group. He was sweating despite the air conditioning, and he kept touching his left arm, where he claimed to have injured himself the previous day. When I asked him about his condition, he insisted that he was fine and ready to help defend our position. Dr. Morrison was concerned about Carlos's behavior and suggested that he might be suffering from stress-related symptoms. The psychological pressure of our situation was affecting everyone differently, and some people were showing signs of severe anxiety and paranoia. I agreed with Dr. Morrison's assessment, but I was beginning to suspect that Carlos's problems might be more serious than stress. The infected individuals were now making their final preparations for breaching the security door. I could hear them positioning themselves for a coordinated assault, and Carlos reported that they had gathered additional tools and weapons from the lower floors. Their level of organization was far beyond what anyone had expected from infected individuals. Patricia Williams was becoming completely hysterical as she realized that we were about to face direct combat with infected individuals. She was convinced that we were all going to die, and her panic was affecting the morale of the other board members. I tried to reassure her that we had prepared for this situation and that our defensive position gave us significant advantages. Around noon, the security door finally gave way under the infected individual's assault. The reinforced steel buckled and twisted, creating an opening large enough for them to enter our executive suite. I could see their faces through the gap, and they looked human except for their eyes, which had a quality that was both predatory and completely empty of emotion. I immediately opened fire with my primary weapon, targeting the infected individuals as they attempted to enter our defensive position. My military training took over, and I focused on accurate shot placement to neutralize threats as efficiently as possible. The infected individuals absorbed damage that would have stopped normal attackers, but they continued advancing with relentless determination. Carlos was supposed to be providing support fire from his position, but I noticed that his performance was erratic and he seemed to be having difficulty concentrating. He was sweating heavily and appeared to be struggling with some kind of internal conflict. When I called for him to adjust his position, he responded slowly and seemed confused about my instructions. The infected individuals were entering our defensive area in waves, and I was using controlled bursts of fire to manage their advance. Amanda and the board members were following their assigned positions, staying low and avoiding the combat area. Dr. Morrison was preparing medical supplies in case anyone was injured during the fighting. Around 12:30, I realized that my ammunition supplies were becoming critically low. I had brought 3 spare magazines for my primary weapon, but the infected individuals required multiple hits to neutralize, and I was expending ammunition faster than I had anticipated. Carlos was supposed to be conserving his ammunition for emergency situations, but his firing pattern suggested he was not following proper protocols. The infected individuals who had breached our defenses were using furniture and debris as cover, demonstrating tactical awareness that was far beyond what anyone had expected. They were coordinating their movements and seemed to understand that they needed to overwhelm our defensive position through superior numbers rather than direct assault. Patricia Williams was screaming and trying to flee toward the windows, but I ordered her to return to her assigned position. Any movement outside our defensive perimeter would expose her to attack and compromise our tactical situation. Robert Chun was helping to restrain her while Dr. Morrison tried to keep her calm. Around 1 o'clock, I noticed that Carlos was exhibiting increasingly strange behavior during the combat. He was having difficulty following my instructions, and His movements seemed uncoordinated and confused. When I looked at him directly, I could see that his eyes had a quality that reminded me of the infected individuals we were fighting. The infected individuals were making steady progress into our defensive area despite our resistance. They were absorbing casualties that would have broken any normal attacking force, but they continued advancing with the same relentless determination they had shown throughout the siege. I realized that we were facing opponents who could not be deterred or discouraged through conventional means. Dr. Morrison was treating minor injuries among the board members, but so far no one had suffered serious wounds. The infected individuals seemed to be focusing their attention on me and Carlos as the primary threats, which gave the others some protection, but also meant that we were bearing the brunt of their assault. Around 1:30, I ran out of ammunition for my primary weapon and switched to my backup knife and tactical gear. Close quarters combat with infected individuals was extremely dangerous because of the infection risk, but I had no choice except to continue defending our position. Carlos was supposed to provide covering fire while I engaged targets at close range. Amanda was following emergency communication protocols, trying to contact any rescue operations that might be available. The radio networks were mostly silent, but she was maintaining hope that someone would respond to our distress calls. Her determination to continue trying was helping to maintain morale among the board members. The infected individuals were now close enough that I could engage them with my knife, and I discovered that they were extremely difficult to stop through conventional means. They seemed to feel no pain and continued attacking even after sustaining injuries that would have incapacitated normal opponents. My military combat training was helpful, but I had to adapt my techniques for opponents who did not respond to conventional tactics. Around 2 o'clock, I realized that Carlos was no longer providing effective support during the combat. He was standing in his assigned position, but his movements were becoming increasingly erratic, and he seemed to be having difficulty distinguishing between our group and the infected individuals. When I called his name, he looked at me with eyes that had the same empty quality I had seen in our attackers. The infected individuals were beginning to overwhelm our defensive position through sheer persistence and numbers. We had neutralized several of them, but more continued to enter through the breached security door. I was beginning to understand that this was not a battle that could be won through conventional tactics, but rather a siege that would continue until one side was completely eliminated. Dr. Morrison was running low on medical supplies, and several of the board members were showing signs of exhaustion and stress. Patricia Williams was in a state of complete panic, and Robert Chun was struggling to maintain his composure as he realized that we might not survive this confrontation. Around 2:30, Carlos suddenly turned toward our group with the same predatory expression I had seen on the faces of the infected individuals. I realized that he had been hiding an infection for hours or possibly days, and that his transformation was now complete. He was no longer the building security guard who had been helping us survive, but had become one of the threats we were fighting against. The confined space of the executive suite meant that there was nowhere to retreat when Carlos turned on us. Amanda screamed as she realized what was happening, and the board members scrambled to get away from him. I had to make a split-second decision about how to protect the group from someone who had been our ally just moments before. I drew my tactical knife and moved to intercept Carlos before he could reach the others. The close-quarters combat was brutal and desperate, complicated by the fact that he retained enough human intelligence to use weapons and tactics effectively. Amanda tried to help by throwing furniture to distract him, but her intervention put her in additional danger. The fight with Carlos lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours as I struggled to protect the group from someone who had been our trusted ally. When it was over, I realized that Amanda had been fatally injured despite my efforts to protect her. She died in my arms while the infected individuals continued their assault on our defensive position. The loss of Amanda was devastating both tactically and emotionally. I had failed to protect my primary client, just as I had failed to save Marcus Whitfield 2 years earlier. The weight of that failure was crushing, but I could not afford to stop fighting because the board members were still depending on me for their survival. I've been trained to spot threats from a mile away, but sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person standing right next to you. The silence that followed Amanda's death was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of infected individuals still moving through the building below us. I held her lifeless body for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, processing the reality that I had failed to protect her, just as I had failed Marcus Whitfield 2 years earlier. The weight of that second failure was crushing in ways that my military training had never prepared me for. Carlos's transformation had been the betrayal I should have seen coming. Looking back, all the signs were there from the very beginning. His distracted behavior on Tuesday morning, the way he kept touching his left arm, his evasive answers about the injury he claimed to have sustained, and his unusual knowledge of the infected individual's movements throughout the building. He had been hiding a bite wound for at least 24 hours, maybe longer. Dr. Morrison was examining Carlos's body, and what he found confirmed my worst suspicions. There was a clear bite mark on his left forearm, partially healed but showing the characteristic red veining that we had learned to associate with the infection. The wound was at least 3 days old, which meant Carlos had been infected before. The outbreak even began at our building. He had been fighting the transformation the entire time he was helping us. The realization that Carlos had been infected from the beginning changed everything about our situation. He had access to all the building's security systems, knew our defensive positions, and had been providing intelligence to help the infected individuals breach our defenses. His detailed knowledge of their movements had not come from security cameras but from some kind of connection with the other infected individuals. Patricia Williams was in complete shock after witnessing Amanda's death and Carlos's transformation. She had retreated to the far corner of the conference room and was refusing to speak or acknowledge what had happened. Robert Chun was trying to comfort her, but he was struggling with his own psychological trauma from watching people he had known for years transform into monsters. Dr. Morrison explained that Carlos's extended period of fighting the infection suggested that some people might have partial immunity or resistance to the virus. However, the transformation was apparently inevitable, and the infected individual's knowledge and memories remained intact even after they lost their humanity. This made them far more dangerous than we had initially understood. I was now alone in defending the remaining board members against whatever threats might still be lurking in the building. My ammunition was completely exhausted, leaving me with only my tactical knife and whatever improvised weapons we could create from office furniture. The infected individuals had temporarily withdrawn after Carlos's death, but I knew they would return once they regrouped. The emergency power systems were beginning to show signs of strain after running continuously for over 48 hours. The backup generators had been designed for short-term emergencies, not for the extended siege we were experiencing. I estimated that we had perhaps 12 hours of power remaining before the building's systems would begin shutting down completely. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I began preparing Amanda's body for burial, though I knew that proper funeral arrangements would be impossible under our circumstances. Dr. Morrison helped me move her to a secure area of the conference room where she would be protected from any further violence. The ritual gave us something to focus on besides our desperate situation. Robert Chun was asking about our options for escape now that our primary defenses had been breached. The executive suite was no longer secure, and we needed to find alternative locations where we could continue to survive. I explained that moving anywhere in the building would expose us to additional risks, but staying in our current location was also becoming increasingly dangerous. The infected individuals were apparently regrouping on the lower floors, and I could hear them moving through the building with renewed purpose. Carlos's transformation might have provided them with detailed intelligence about our remaining defenses and the layout of the executive suite. They would know exactly where to find us and how to overcome any barriers we might establish. Dr. Morrison was concerned about the psychological impact of our situation on the surviving board members. Patricia Williams was showing signs of severe trauma and was not responding to attempts at communication. Robert Chun was functional but clearly struggling with the stress of watching his colleagues die violently. The human cost of survival was becoming as significant as the physical threats we faced. Around 4 o'clock, I made the decision to relocate our group to a more defensible position within the executive suite. The conference room had too many access points and windows that could be breached by determined attackers. I identified a smaller office area that could be more easily defended with our limited resources and manpower. The process of moving to our new defensive position required careful coordination to avoid exposure to potential threats. I went first to clear the route and establish security, while Dr. Morrison helped Patricia Williams and Robert Chun move their essential supplies. Every step outside the conference room felt like we were walking into an ambush. The smaller office I had selected was Amanda's private workspace, which felt appropriate given that she had been my primary responsibility. The room had only one entrance, reinforced walls, and a secure communication system that might allow us to contact rescue operations if any became available. It also contained emergency supplies that Amanda had stored for corporate crisis situations. Patricia Williams was becoming increasingly unstable as the psychological pressure of our situation continued to mount. She was convinced that we were all going to die and that our efforts to survive were pointless. Her defeatist attitude was affecting Robert Chun's morale, and I was concerned that panic might compromise our remaining defensive capabilities. Around 5 o'clock, the infected individuals began testing our new defensive position. I could hear them moving through the executive suite, apparently searching for our new location. Their movements were systematic and coordinated, suggesting that they retained enough intelligence to conduct organized searches and adapt to changing situations. Dr. Morrison was rationing our remaining medical supplies and trying to maintain basic hygiene standards to prevent additional health problems. Our food and water supplies were also running low, and we would need to make critical decisions about rationing if we were going to survive for more than another day or two. The communication equipment in Amanda's office was more sophisticated than what we had been using in the conference room, but most radio frequencies were still silent. I was able to pick up fragmentary transmissions from military units, but they were apparently dealing with situations that were just as desperate as ours. There was no indication that organized rescue operations were being conducted. Robert Chun was trying to process the financial implications of what we were witnessing. Meridian Pharmaceuticals, like most major corporations, would probably cease to exist as a functioning entity within days. The global economy was collapsing as rapidly as civilization itself, and traditional measures of wealth and success had become meaningless. Around 6 o'clock, the infected individuals located our new defensive position and began probing for weaknesses. They were using the same systematic approach that had eventually allowed them to breach our primary defenses, but the smaller office provided fewer access points and was easier to defend with our limited resources. I had positioned furniture to create additional barriers around the single entrance to Amanda's office, and I was using her desk as a firing position that would give me tactical advantages if the infected individuals managed to breach our defenses. Dr. Morrison was preparing medical supplies in case anyone was injured, while Patricia Williams and Robert Chen were positioned in the safest area of the room. The infected individuals were apparently learning from their previous encounters with us. They were using more sophisticated tactics and seemed to understand that direct assault had been costly for them. Instead, they were implementing what appeared to be a siege strategy designed to wear down our defenses through attrition rather than direct attack. Dr. Morrison was explaining his theory about the infection's effects on human intelligence and memory. He believed that the virus preserved certain cognitive functions while eliminating others, allowing infected individuals to retain tactical knowledge and problem-solving abilities while losing all sense of empathy or self-preservation. This made them perfect predators who could adapt to resistance without being deterred by casualties. Around 7 o'clock, the building's emergency power systems began experiencing intermittent failures. The lights would flicker off for several seconds before the backup generators restored power, but these outages were becoming more frequent and lasting longer. I realized that we were approaching the limits of the building's emergency capabilities. Patricia Williams was asking about the possibility of surrender or negotiation with the infected individuals. She seemed to believe that there might be some way to communicate with them or convince them to leave us alone. Dr. Morrison and I both explained that the infected had lost all capacity for reasoning or empathy, making any form of negotiation impossible. The infected individuals were maintaining constant pressure on our defensive position without actually attacking. They seemed to understand that we had limited resources and that time was working in their favor. This psychological warfare was as effective as direct assault in wearing down our morale and defensive capabilities. Robert Chun was concerned about his family in Beverly Hills and wondering if they had survived the outbreak. The inability to contact loved ones was one of the most difficult aspects of our situation, and the uncertainty about their fate was almost as traumatic as the physical dangers we were facing. Around 8 o'clock, I noticed that the infected individuals were becoming more active as darkness fell over the city. Their movements were more aggressive, and they seemed to be preparing for a renewed assault on our position. The approaching night would limit our visibility and give them tactical advantages that they had not possessed during daylight hours. Dr. Morrison was reviewing our medical supplies and warning us about the health risks of our prolonged confinement. Dehydration and exhaustion were becoming serious concerns, and our stress levels were approaching dangerous limits. He was particularly worried about Patricia Williams, who was showing signs of severe psychological breakdown. The communication equipment was picking up increasingly desperate transmissions from other survivor groups throughout the city. Most of these messages were calls for help that went unanswered, but they confirmed that we were not the only people trying to survive in isolated defensive positions. The scope of the crisis was far beyond what any emergency response system could handle. Patricia Williams was demanding that we attempt to escape from the building and try to reach one of the evacuation centers that had been mentioned in the early news broadcasts. I explained that those evacuation centers had been overrun hours ago and that leaving our defensive position would expose us to far greater danger than remaining in place. Around 9 o'clock, the infected individuals began their evening assault on our defensive position. They were using coordinated attacks on multiple points simultaneously, forcing me to divide my attention between several potential breach points. The tactical challenge was far more complex than anything I had faced during my military service. The office furniture I had used to create barriers was beginning to show signs of stress under the infected individuals' persistent attacks. They were using tools and debris as weapons, demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that suggested they were learning from their previous encounters with human defenders. Dr. Morrison was helping to reinforce our barriers using medical equipment and office supplies, but our improvised defenses were not designed to withstand prolonged assault. I was beginning to realize that our current position would eventually be overrun unless we could find some way to eliminate the threat permanently. Robert Chun was asking about the possibility of creating weapons using office equipment and cleaning supplies. His suggestion about improvised explosives was technically feasible, but the risk of accidentally injuring ourselves was significant. I decided to keep his ideas in reserve while continuing to rely on conventional defensive tactics. Around 10 o'clock, one of the infected individuals managed to create a small breach in our barrier system. I was able to neutralize the threat using my tactical knife, but the encounter confirmed that our defenses were failing, and that we would soon face direct combat in the confined space of Amanda's office. The psychological pressure of constant threat was affecting everyone differently. Patricia Williams had withdrawn into complete silence. Robert Chen was becoming increasingly agitated, and Dr. Morrison was struggling to maintain his professional composure. The human cost of survival was becoming as significant as the physical challenges we faced. The building's power systems were now failing regularly, with outages lasting several minutes at a time. During these blackouts, we were completely dependent on emergency lighting that provided minimal visibility. The infected individuals seemed to be adapting to these conditions more effectively than we were. Dr. Morrison was explaining that the infection might be affecting the infected individuals' sensory capabilities in ways that gave them advantages in low-light conditions. Their ability to coordinate attacks during power outages suggested that they were using senses other than vision to navigate and communicate. Around 11 o'clock, I realized that our situation was becoming hopeless. Our defenses were failing. Our supplies were nearly exhausted, and the infected individuals were showing no signs of giving up their siege. I began making preparations for what might be our final stand, ensuring that everyone understood the gravity of our situation. The emergency communication equipment was now completely silent except for automated distress signals that played on continuous loops. There was no indication that anyone was monitoring these frequencies or that rescue operations were being conducted anywhere in the city. We were truly on our own. Patricia Williams was asking me to promise that I would not let her be taken alive by the infected individuals. The request was heartbreaking, but I understood her fear of what might happen if she was captured and infected. I assured her that I would protect everyone in our group for as long as possible. Robert Chun was trying to record final messages for his family using his cell phone, even though there was no way to transmit them. The act of creating these recordings seemed to give him some comfort, and I encouraged him to continue as long as it helped him maintain his composure. Around midnight, the infected individuals launched what appeared to be their final assault on our defensive position. They had coordinated their attack to coincide with another power outage, and they were using their superior numbers to overwhelm our remaining barriers. I realized that this was the moment I had been preparing for since the outbreak began. I thought losing Marcus was the worst failure of my career, but watching Amanda die in my arms made me realize that some battles cannot be won, only survived. The final assault came with a ferocity that overwhelmed our remaining defenses within minutes. The infected individuals had coordinated their attack perfectly with the power outage, and in the darkness of Amanda's office, I found myself fighting opponents I could barely see. My tactical knife was my only weapon, and the close-quarters combat was more brutal than anything I had experienced during my military service in Afghanistan. Dr. Morrison was struck down while trying to protect Patricia Williams, and his medical expertise died with him. Robert Chun attempted to help by throwing office equipment at the attackers, but he was overwhelmed by their superior numbers and relentless aggression. Within 15 minutes of the assault beginning, I was the only member of our group still alive and fighting. The silence that followed the attack was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The infected individuals had achieved their objective and withdrawn from Amanda's office, leaving me alone with the bodies of people I had promised to protect. The weight of my complete failure was crushing, but my military training forced me to continue functioning even when everything seemed hopeless. I spent the next hour moving through the executive suite, checking for any other survivors and assessing what remained of our defensive positions. The infected individuals had systematically destroyed everything we had built to protect ourselves, but they had not remained in the area after eliminating the perceived threats. Their withdrawal suggested that they were operating according to some kind of strategy rather than random violence. The building's emergency power systems were now failing completely, with outages lasting for hours at a time. The backup generators had been running continuously for over 60 hours, far beyond their designed operational limits. I calculated that we had perhaps 6 hours of intermittent power remaining before the building systems would shut down permanently. I gathered what remained of our emergency supplies and established a temporary position in the building's executive bathroom, the same location where I am recording this account. The bathroom had a reinforced door, no windows, and a separate ventilation system that would provide some protection if the infected individuals returned. It was not a long-term solution, but it gave me time to process what had happened and plan my next moves. The psychological impact of being completely alone after 3 days of constant companionship was more difficult than I had anticipated. The silence was broken only by distant sounds of infected individuals moving through the building and the occasional emergency vehicle siren from the streets far below. I realized that I was probably one of the last living people in the entire Meridian Tower. My attempts to contact Elena in San Francisco had failed completely since the cellular networks collapsed on Wednesday morning. I had no way of knowing whether she was alive or dead, and the uncertainty was almost as traumatic as watching my clients die. She was the only family I had left, and not being able to protect her was another failure that weighed heavily on my conscience. Around 2:00 in the morning on Friday, I began taking inventory of my remaining resources. I had approximately 8 ounces of water, 2 energy bars, basic medical supplies, my tactical knife, and the emergency radio equipment I had salvaged from Amanda's office. My tactical vest had protected me from injury during the final assault, but it was damaged and would not provide reliable protection in future encounters. The emergency radio was picking up fragmentary transmissions from other survivor groups, but most of these communications were desperate calls for help that went unanswered. I heard reports from people trapped in similar situations throughout Los Angeles, confirming that the outbreak had affected the entire metropolitan area. The scope of the crisis was far beyond what any emergency response system could handle. I tried broadcasting my own distress signal, identifying myself as a federal security contractor and requesting evacuation assistance, the radio protocol I had learned during my military service required specific identification codes and emergency frequencies, but none of my transmissions received any response. Either no one was monitoring these channels, or the infrastructure for coordinating rescue operations had completely collapsed. The infected individuals were still present in the building, and I could hear them moving through the floors below with what seemed like renewed purpose. Their behavior patterns had changed since they eliminated our group, and they appeared to be conducting systematic searches of areas they had not previously explored. I realized that my temporary safety in the executive bathroom would not last indefinitely. Around 3:00, I began reviewing everything I knew about the building's layout and emergency systems, looking for options I might have overlooked during our defensive preparations. Amanda had mentioned during our initial security briefing that the building had a helicopter landing pad on the roof, designed for emergency evacuations of senior executives. The roof access was controlled by the same security systems I had been using, and it might provide an escape route if I could reach it safely. The helicopter pad had not been part of my original security assessment because we had never anticipated needing aerial evacuation. However, the building's emergency protocols included procedures for accessing the roof during crisis situations, and I still had the security codes Amanda had provided on Tuesday morning. If any rescue operations were being conducted, aircraft would be the most likely method of evacuation from high-rise buildings. My biggest challenge would be reaching the roof without encountering the infected individuals who were still moving through the building. The stairwell access to the roof was on the opposite side of the building from my current location, and I would need to cross areas that were almost certainly occupied by hostile forces. My tactical training had taught me infiltration techniques, but I had never applied them to avoiding infected humans in an urban environment. Around 4 o'clock, I began making specific preparations for attempting to reach the roof. I would need to travel light to move quietly and quickly, which meant abandoning most of the emergency supplies I had gathered. I kept only essential items: my tactical knife, the emergency radio, basic medical supplies, and the security access codes for the building's systems. The building's emergency lighting was now functioning only intermittently, which would provide both advantages and disadvantages for my movement. The darkness would help me avoid detection by infected individuals, but it would also make navigation more difficult and increase the risk of accidents. I decided to wait until the next power outage to begin my movement, using the cover of complete darkness to mask my approach to the stairwells. I spent the waiting time reviewing my memories of Amanda, Dr. Morrison, Patricia Williams, Robert, Chun, and even Carlos before his transformation. These people had trusted me to protect them, and I had failed them just as I had failed Marcus Whitfield 2 years earlier. The pattern of failure was becoming clear, and I began to question whether I was fundamentally unsuited for protection work. Marcus Whitfield had been a technology entrepreneur who had received death threats from competitors, trying to steal his company's research. I was assigned to protect him during a corporate conference in Seattle, but I made a tactical error that allowed an assassin to get close enough to kill him. The official investigation concluded that the attack was unforeseeable, but I knew that my failure to anticipate the threat had cost Marcus his life. The similarities between Marcus's death and Amanda's death were disturbing. In both cases, I had been responsible for protecting high-value clients who were facing specific threats. In both cases, I had failed to identify the most dangerous threat until it was too late. Marcus had been killed by someone who had infiltrated the conference security, and Amanda had been killed by Carlos, who had been infected and hiding among our group. Around 5 o'clock, the building experienced another extended power outage, and I decided that this was my opportunity to attempt reaching the roof. I left the executive bathroom for the first time in over 3 hours, moving slowly and carefully through the darkened executive suite. The infected individuals had left obvious signs of their presence, but they did not appear to be in the immediate area. The hallway leading to the stairwell access was littered with debris from their earlier activities, and I had to navigate carefully to avoid making noise that might attract their attention. My military training in stealth movement was helpful, but the urban environment presented challenges that were different from the rural combat zones where I had learned these techniques. I reached the stairwell access door without encountering any infected individuals, but the security system was functioning only sporadically due to the power failures. I had to wait several minutes for the electronic lock to reset before I could use Amanda's access codes to open the door. Every second of delay increased the risk that infected individuals would discover my location. The stairwell leading to the roof was completely dark, and I had to rely on tactile navigation to move upward safely. The infected individuals had apparently not explored this area extensively, because I found no evidence of their presence on the stairs. However, I could hear them moving through other parts of the building, and their activity seemed to be increasing as the morning progressed. Around 6 o'clock, I reached the roof access door and discovered that it was secured by a different electronic lock system than the stairwell. Amanda's security codes were not sufficient to open this barrier, and I would need to find alternative methods of accessing the helicopter pad. My tactical training included techniques for bypassing electronic security systems, but these procedures would take time and might attract unwanted attention. I spent nearly 30 minutes working on the roof access door, using techniques I had learned during Special Forces training to override the electronic lock mechanism. The process required careful manipulation of the security system's control circuits, and I had to work in complete darkness to avoid being detected by any infected individuals who might be patrolling the upper floors. When I finally gained access to the roof, I discovered that the helicopter pad was larger and more sophisticated than I had expected. The landing area was designed to accommodate medium-sized aircraft, and it included emergency communication equipment that might allow me to contact rescue operations directly. However, the roof was completely exposed to the elements, and I would be visible to anyone monitoring the area from aircraft or other high-rise buildings. The view from the roof provided my first clear assessment of the situation throughout Los Angeles since the outbreak began. The city was burning in multiple locations, with smoke columns rising from dozens of fires that were apparently burning without any firefighting response. Most neighborhoods were completely dark due to power grid failures, and I could see very little normal vehicle traffic on the streets below. Around 7 o'clock, I activated the helicopter pad's emergency communication system and began broadcasting distress signals on multiple frequencies. The equipment was more powerful than the radio I had been using, and it was designed specifically for contacting aircraft and emergency services. However, most of the frequencies I monitored were either silent or carrying automated distress signals from other locations. I was able to pick up fragmentary communications from military units that were apparently operating in other parts of Southern California, but their transmission suggested that they were dealing with situations that were just as desperate as what I had experienced. There was no indication that organized rescue operations were being conducted in the Los Angeles area, and the military units seemed to be focused on containing the outbreak rather than evacuating survivors. The emergency communication equipment included a GPS beacon that would allow rescue aircraft to locate my position precisely, but activating this system would also alert any hostile forces that might be monitoring emergency frequencies. I decided to activate the beacon for short periods while monitoring for aircraft, but to keep it off most of the time to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The helicopter pad included emergency supplies that had been stored for crisis situations, including additional food, water, medical equipment, and basic survival gear. These supplies had apparently been intended for corporate executives who might need to wait on the roof for evacuation, and they were far superior to what I had been able to salvage from the executive suite. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the distinctive sound of aircraft engines in the distance, and I immediately activated the GPS beacon while monitoring the emergency communication frequencies. The aircraft appeared to be military helicopters conducting reconnaissance missions rather than evacuation operations, but they represented the first sign of organized response I had observed since the outbreak began. I attempted to contact the aircraft using standard military communication protocols, identifying myself as a federal security contractor and requesting immediate evacuation assistance. The initial response was encouraging, with the aircraft crew acknowledging my transmission and requesting my current status and the number of people requiring evacuation. When I reported that I was the sole survivor from a group of 6 people who had been trapped in the Meridian Tower, the aircraft crew's response became more cautious. They wanted detailed information about how the other members of my group had died and whether I had been exposed to infected individuals. The questioning suggested that they were following strict protocols to prevent infected individuals from gaining access to rescue operations. The helicopter crew explained that they were conducting reconnaissance missions to assess the extent of the outbreak and identify potential evacuation sites. However, actual rescue operations were being limited to specific high-priority personnel, and civilian evacuations had been suspended due to the risk of infection spreading to secure areas. They could not provide immediate evacuation, but would report my location for possible future rescue operations. Around 9 o'clock, the aircraft departed after providing me with updated information about the situation throughout Southern California. The outbreak had affected all major metropolitan areas, and state authorities were implementing emergency protocols that prioritize containing the infection over rescuing individual survivors. Military forces were establishing secure perimeters around unaffected areas, but these operations would take weeks or months to complete. The communication with the military helicopter had provided some hope, but it also confirmed that I would need to survive on my own for an extended period before any rescue operations became possible. The supplies on the helicopter pad would allow me to remain on the roof for several days, but I would eventually need to find alternative shelter or attempt to reach one of the secure areas being established outside the city. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing my options and making plans for long-term survival. The helicopter pad was relatively secure, but it was also completely exposed and would become untenable if weather conditions deteriorated. The building below was occupied by infected individuals, but it also contained resources that I might need if I was forced to remain in the area for weeks or months. Around noon, I began recording this account of the events that had occurred during the first 72 hours of the outbreak. The details were still fresh in my memory, and I wanted to document what I had learned about the infection and the behavior of infected individuals for any future survivors who might find this information useful. The story I have told you represents everything I experienced during those first 3 days when the world as we knew it came to an end. The mistakes I made, the people I failed to save, and the lessons I learned about survival in an environment where the normal rules of civilization no longer applied. If anyone is listening to this recording, I hope that my experiences can help you avoid the errors that cost so many lives. Elena, if you are somehow able to hear this, I want you to know that I tried to contact you every day since the outbreak began. I hope you found somewhere safe and that you remember the emergency procedures we discussed when you were in college. Stay away from large groups, trust your instincts about people who seem wrong, and never let anyone get close enough to grab you if you have any doubts about their condition. The infected individuals are not the mindless zombies that movies and television shows have portrayed. They retain enough intelligence to use tools, coordinate attacks, and remember information from their previous lives. They can be patient when necessary, and they never give up once they have identified a target. The most dangerous ones are those who have been recently infected, because they still look and act mostly human until the final transformation occurs. The scratching at the bathroom door has been getting louder for the past hour, and I think they have finally tracked me to my current location. It is time for me to leave this temporary shelter and attempt to reach a more secure position. Whether that means returning to the roof or finding another hiding place in the building, I cannot say. What I can tell you with certainty is that survival in this new world requires constant vigilance, careful planning, and the willingness to make impossible choices. Trust is a luxury that can cost you your life, but complete isolation will drive you insane. The balance between these extremes is something that every survivor will need to find for themselves. I have learned that some battles cannot be won, only survived, and that the greatest threats often come from the people you trust most. The infection does not just kill people, it turns them into perfect predators who can use their human knowledge and memories to hunt the living more effectively than any wild animal. If I do not survive whatever comes next, I hope that someone will find this recording and learn from the mistakes I made during those first 72 hours. The people I failed to protect deserved better than what I was able to give them, but perhaps their deaths can serve some purpose if they help others survive what is coming. The world has changed in ways that none of us could have anticipated, and the old rules about protection, loyalty, and survival no longer apply. We are all starting over in a reality where yesterday's allies can become today's deadliest enemies, and where the skills that kept us alive before may not be sufficient for what we face now. This is Joaquin Herrera, federal security contractor, recording on Friday, October 18th, 2024, 72 hours after the outbreak began. If anyone is listening, remember that survival is not just about staying alive, but about remaining human in a world that has forgotten what humanity means.